Picture the most overcrowded, sunlight-deprived city you've ever stepped foot in. New York, Birmingham, Kowloon Walled City. Now multiply that by 1,000, and you've got a slow Tuesday in a Hive city. Somewhere in a YouTube comment section, someone typed, "So Hive cities are just the grimdark New Yorks of the Imperium," and got 214 likes and 19 replies. Those replies branched outward into Kowloon, Detroit, Jackson, a spontaneous collaborative exercise in urban pattern recognition that nobody coordinated. The audience just knew, because they've been to cities. They know what happens when infrastructure degrades and density compounds and the people at the top stop caring about the people at the bottom. They've ridden a subway at 2 a.m. and felt the specific atmosphere of a place built to be used, not loved. Hive cities feel familiar because they're the recognizable endpoint of something already in motion. They're not alien, they're extrapolated. And the joke, "It's just New York," is correct right up until it isn't. And the exact moment it stops being correct is where Warhammer 40K stops being entertainment and starts being something genuinely uncomfortable. What a Hive city actually is. The Imperium of Man spans the galaxy. Across it sit 32,380 worlds classified as Hive worlds, planets given over almost entirely to concentrated vertical urban production. The entire planetary surface functions as geological infrastructure for the city stacked on top of it. The land is used up. The ocean, if one exists, services the port complexes. What remains is the hive. Hive cities don't sprawl outward, they climb. The physics relates to geothermal vents. Hive cities are typically built over natural heat sources, and vertical construction captures thermal energy more efficiently than lateral sprawl. So they build up and up for thousands of years, each generation laying structure on top of the previous generation's decay. At some point, the structure stops being designed and starts being accumulated. At some further point, nobody has a complete map of what's at the bottom. And the people who've tried to survey the lowest sections haven't consistently returned to file the report. Hive Primus on Necromunda, the best documented individual hive city in the lore, stands approximately 12 miles above the planetary surface, with the lower sections extending roughly 4 miles into the planetary crust. The footprint is a truncated cone, roughly 8 kilometers at the base, narrowing toward the top. Rockcrete and adamantium, layered formations. Much of the structure predates the current Imperium. The oldest sections aren't ruins in the usual sense, they're foundations. They're what the hive is sitting on. Whatever existed before became the ground floor. Standard population per hive city, 10 to 100 billion. Hive Primus at Necromunda, 10 billion. Hive Tersium on Atoma Prime, the city you've been shooting through in Darktide if you've played it, approximately 90 billion. For context, Earth currently has 8 billion people, total across the entire planet. Hive Tersium alone contains more than 11 times that number. Tertium is mid-range by Hive city standards. Outside the Hive walls, a permanent cloud layer of airborne industrial pollution surrounds these structures. The great spires rise through that cloud like islands appearing out of an ashen sea. The people at the top can theoretically see blue sky. The people at the bottom never will. Necromunda, a floor-by-floor inspection. Necromunda, originally catalogued as Irenaeus Prime before the Imperium absorbed it, produces weapons and munitions for surrounding planetary systems at industrial scale. The most heavily documented hive world in the lore. The planet's surface is canonically described as an environment where the ash corrodes equipment and poisons organic life, where no unpolluted air, food, or water can be found anywhere outside the hive walls. That's the outside. Inside is better, marginally. Start at the top. The spire sits above the pollution cloud layer, a physical cloud of airborne industrial waste that permanently encircles hive cities at mid-level, thick enough to block sunlight from ever reaching the structures below. The wealth buys altitude, and altitude buys light. Spire residents have access to real sunlight, real food, actual agricultural produce described as an expensive luxury only the most prestigious necromundans can afford, clean air, and the best medical care available in the 41st millennium. Every Spire family has the equivalent of a mansion or villa. Noble houses run the political structure up here. One sentence, because the lore enrichers already know, and the politics don't change the physical reality, which is that the Spire operates as a penthouse economy regardless of the family name on the deed. A gunfight hundreds of levels below sends a stray round traveling upward through the hive structure. A bored noble leaning on a railing in the Spire suddenly slumps dead. Nobody below ever knows. The bullet just kept going until it ran out of city. The structural relationship between the Spire and everything beneath it flows mostly in one direction. Waste products descend, power bills ascend, and occasionally a round completes the full vertical journey uninvited. The Spire residents don't experience the lower levels as a problem. They experience them as a background hum, a distant industrial sound, occasionally a column of smoke visible on the cloud layer when viewed from above. That's the extent of it. The mid-hive is the outer boroughs of this analogy, the grinding layer. Clan-dominated manufactory zones. Workers paying a premium for every watt of power consumed, because the guilds controlling distribution have no regulatory pressure to be reasonable about pricing. The infrastructure here is functional in the way that real, dense cities are functional, which is to say, barely, at cost, and with the constant awareness that the machinery you depend on was designed for a population 3 generations smaller than the one currently living here. The mid-hive grinds. The lore doesn't dwell here because there's nothing to heroize. It's just life. The underhive starts where official hive society stops pretending to administer you. The official description of this territory uses phrases like a no man's land and the bad zones, a place where a person can make a new beginning or come to a sudden end. The less official version, an area defined almost entirely by what the mid-hive disposed of. The ruins at the base of the underhive predate the current hive structure by many centuries, even millennia. Previous civilizations built here, previous hive structures. The current hive was constructed on top of them, and what remained of the old architecture became the foundation layer of the new one. The underhive resident lives in those ruins. Not the metaphorical ruins of a declining neighborhood, but literal ancient architecture that has been abandoned, reoccupied, sealed off, broken into again, flooded with industrial runoff, and partially consumed by what eventually became the sump. The sump, the absolute bottom. Described canonically as a vast sea of toxic effluent runoff, the cumulative waste of hive industry and urban decay. Submerged towers are down there, the ruins of previous civilizations consumed by centuries of industrial byproduct, with upper floors visible above the surface at low water and submerged when the sump rises. Gangs and corporations run chemical extraction operations on the banks, separating useful industrial inputs from the mass. Lone prospectors work the shallows with the kind of methodical focus that requires complete dissociation from what you're standing in. Submersible vehicles exist specifically for deeper navigation. The sump isn't an accident or a failure. It's a resource pool. Someone is profiting from it. Daily life in the underhive runs on a set of informal systems that are, by necessity, more reliable than any official infrastructure. The corpse grinder guilds process the dead into food. Corpse starch, widely understood in lore as a synthetic food derived from the recycled dead of hive worlds, distributed as a gray paste. The water guild moves recycled water downward through the hive at a price calibrated for monopoly conditions. The air guild controls the flow of breathable air through the hive cities of Necromunda, and the air, like the water, has been through the rest of the hive first. The canonical description is precise. Air enters at the spire level, passes through billions of people at successive levels, and is pumped progressively downward, growing ever more bitter and poisonous the further down it filters. In portions of the underhive, it's documented as lethally toxic. The Air Guild sells this product. People buy it because the alternative is faster. Power is the currency that keeps everything minimally operational. Running water stills. Running whatever lighting sources haven't burned out. Cultivating what the underhive can produce in darkness. Fungal crops, edible slimes. That phrase appears in actual Necromunda source material documenting the lower hive economy, listed without dramatic emphasis alongside other trade goods. People grow the slimes, trade them, eat them, and the lore mentions it with the same matter-of-fact register as any other commodity. This isn't presented as unusual. This is the underhive's agricultural sector. Official Necromunda creative material describes the air in the lower hive as something that stings the eyes and burns the throat. A thick, toxic density that isn't emergency conditions, just conditions. Violence registered as background noise. The way the machinery is background noise, because in the underhive, neither ever stops. Something you stopped noticing years ago. Something you smell when you step outside your dwelling. The Ian Watson novel, Space Marine, contains a passage about hive inhabitants that functions as the setting's philosophical anchor, a character reflecting that people born into these conditions can't conceive of any other because there's a subtle poison in the germplasm they receive. The argument is that adaptation runs deep enough that the conditions aren't experienced as conditions anymore. They're experienced as reality. The person cultivating edible slimes by salvaged lighting doesn't think of themselves as surviving in extremis. They're running a small business in their neighborhood. The neighborhood happens to be built on the ruins of a civilization nobody can name, in total darkness, breathing air that has already been breathed by 50 million people above them. But they've never known anything else, so the concept of something else has no traction. Games Workshop published a sardonic travel guide to the ash wastes outside the hives in 2022. Official content, written in the same register you'd use for a real tourism piece. It noted that proper preparation might bring your chance of survival even below 90%. The setting has always known it's describing something absurd. The inhabitants just can't see it from the inside. Kowloon Walled City, the real prototype in 1994. In 1987, the government of Hong Kong performed a census of the Kowloon Walled City and counted approximately 33,000 residents living in 2.6 hectares, roughly the size of 2 rugby fields, producing a population density of approximately 1.25 million people per square kilometer. The most densely populated settlement in recorded human history. Manhattan, considered claustrophobically dense by American standards, runs at roughly 70,000 people per square mile. Kowloon ran at 3.2 million per square mile, 45 times denser than Manhattan. The buildings, roughly 300 of them, 10 to 14 stories each, had evolved from individual structures into a single, interconnected labyrinthine megastructure through decades of completely unregulated construction. No architects, no planning permission. Structures leaned into each other and had corridors cut between them, and were treated as a single mass rather than separate properties. The corridors between buildings measured around 2 meters wide. No sunlight reached street level. None. The vertical mass was too dense, too tightly interlocked, for light to penetrate to the ground. Residents navigated by improvised electrical rigging strung between buildings at whatever height the builder could reach. Air conditioning units dripped onto the corridors from above. Pipes ran exposed along every wall and ceiling. Locals carried umbrellas not for rain, specifically for the drip from the overhead pipes. The local name was Hak Nam, the City of Darkness. The testimony of people who spent time inside is consistent across independent accounts. The corridors were dark regardless of time of day. Narrow, damp, loud. Machinery clanking and humming from apartment-sized factories running metal fabrication and molded plastic production and food processing, all operating in spaces a contemporary building code would classify as residential. if it classified them at all. Street stalls selling dim sum and fishball soup and roasted meats sat between factory entrances. Unlicensed doctors and dentists operated consultation rooms beside cafes and brothels, their mainland Chinese credentials valid nowhere in British Hong Kong, which meant they ran without any regulatory oversight at all, and were, by most accounts, perfectly competent. The density wasn't pure squalor. It was dense, mixed-use urban life compressed so far that every category blurred into every other category. All of it operating in permanent, literal darkness. All of it generating enough economic activity to sustain 33,000 people in 2.6 hectares for decades. The roof was the only sky available. Rooftop gardens, garbage dumps, children flying kites among a forest of TV antennas, pigeon races on weekend mornings. The roof was where people went to see something other than walls. Open air, above you. Technically, a sky. One you had to climb to reach. 10 to 14 stories above the street that never saw light. And most residents didn't make it up every day. The governance structure ran two parallel tracks simultaneously. The Sun-Yeon triads functionally controlled access and territory during the peak years, before sustained police operations in the 1970s reduced their dominance. A neighborhood welfare association handled sanitation coordination and served as the formal liaison point with the colonial government. Both systems were necessary, and neither was sufficient alone. The place wasn't anarchic. It ran on informal law, on negotiated authority, on the practical reality that 33,000 people in 2 hectares require some organizing principle or the whole thing collapses in a week. It had its own internal logic and, by most first-hand accounts, a genuine community solidarity that the outside reputation never reflected. Demolition was announced February 15, 1987. The New York Times ran a headline that year, "Hong Kong's worst slum seems pleased to face its doom." Residents were compensated and relocated. Demolition completed in 1994. Public park now, with a bronze-scale model of what used to be there sitting in the middle of the green space. Kowloon existed in its extreme form for roughly 40 years before being judged politically intolerable and cleared. The underhive of Hive Primus contains ruins that predate the current hive structure by centuries, even millennia, multiple previous civilizations, each building on the wreckage of the last. Nobody is demolishing the underhive. The chemicals the sump prospectors extract are industrial inputs. The corpse starch the guilds produce is food. The lower levels bear the physical weight of everything built above them. The underhive isn't a problem waiting to be solved. It's the foundation. Birmingham has post-industrial sadness, a specific ambient gray. People who'll fight you over whether the bullring counts as architecture, and a canal network that genuinely tried its best. A hive city has all of that, plus the sump. Hell's Reach, the Hell's Reach Dockers Union, and why you should know their name. Hive Hell's Reach, also rendered as Hell's Reach, is a full, independent hive city on the planet Armageddon, located on the subcontinent of Armageddon Secundus. A complete hive city in its own right, devoted primarily to fuel production, its specific geographic identity being the only port on Armageddon with a full refining complex, situated on a body of water named, without irony, the Ocean of Storms. Hell's Highway, a broad, fortified road built specifically to move armored vehicles and titans, connects it to Hive Infernus. The city exists because the Imperium needs fuel, and someone has to work the refinery. Armageddon sits approximately 10,000 light-years northeast of Terra in Segmentum Solar, classified as both Hive World and Industrial World. In M41.999, at the close of the 41st millennium, Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka's Orc Armada entered the system. 6 weeks after entering, it engaged the Imperial space stations in orbit. Then it came groundside. Before any of that, a shift at the docks. The workers of Hell's Reach are members of a named organization, the Hell's Reach Dockers Union, explicitly referenced in Aaron Dembski Bowden's Black Library novel Hell's Reach, with the Union's head representative serving as a significant secondary character throughout the book. Before the war, before the siege, before any of the history that made Hell's Reach a name people know, there was a port, fuel tankers docking on the ocean of storms, cargo being offloaded, refinery quotas to meet on a schedule that the Imperium's war machine sets and does not negotiate, shift rotations, equipment checks, the specific grinding fatigue of industrial port labor in a city that smells of promethium and recycled air, where stepping outside means stepping onto the surface of Armageddon Secundus, a planet described as inhospitable, its surface providing no clean air, no clean water, nothing the human body can use without industrial mediation. The dock worker arrives for a shift the same way a mid-hive laborer anywhere arrives. They clock in, they work. They go back to wherever they sleep, which may be a dormitory block in the lower sections of the port complex, close enough to the work that the vibration of the machinery is background noise rather than intrusion, something the nervous system filed away as irrelevant years ago. The smell of promethium is constant. The sound of the ocean of storms reaching the port walls is constant. If you've grown up in this city, you've never heard silence in the way that requires an absence of machinery. This isn't experienced as hardship. This is Tuesday. When the Third War for Armageddon reached Hell's Reach, 60% of the Hive's civilian population was in the docks. That's the documented figure, not 60% of a military contingent, not 60% of designated emergency shelter occupants. 60% of all civilians, sheltering in the port facilities because the docks were the city's largest enclosed space and the place where most people who worked in this city worked. The dockers and their families were in the most important part of the city, which meant they were in the part of the city the orcs needed to capture. Imperial Military Command explicitly discussed whether to arm the dock workers. The conclusion, documented in the novel, was against it. The logic, arm the workers and they die in combat. And if the Hive survives the war, it has no skilled workforce left to operate the refinery that justifies the Hive's existence. They were assessed as more valuable alive and untrained than dead and fighting. This is the Imperium's calculation made visible. The worker is infrastructure, and you don't expend infrastructure in pitched battle if you can avoid it. The dockyards were taken anyway. Aaron Dembski Bowden's novel frames the siege of Hell's Reach as a grinding, weeks-long affair in which every meter the orcs advance into the city costs lives. Chaplain Grimaldus and approximately 100 Black Templars carry the Space Marine perspective. But the Dockers Union runs through the narrative as the civilian baseline. The people who arrived for work and found themselves in the center of an alien invasion for which no job description exists. The novel keeps returning to them because Dembski Bowden understands that Grimaldus's story only has weight when measured against theirs. There is no clause in a Hive City labor agreement that covers alien invasion. Based on what the lore documents about working conditions more broadly, guild monopolies on air and water, power billed by the watt, food that may include what's collected by the corpse grinder guilds, there's barely evidence of clauses covering ordinary industrial accidents. These are people who have never seen open sky, never breathed air that didn't come through a guild pipe, working a fuel refinery in a city whose name references a destination from Christian theology's most pessimistic geography, on an ocean named the Ocean of Storms. And then the orcs came through the gates. The Dockers Union is the emotional center of what a Hive City is. The Hive City isn't the Space Marines. The noble houses get one sentence, and then we move on. The Hive City is the Union member who clocked in for a shift and got a siege, with no preparation and no choice except whether to run or stay, in a structure they've lived inside their entire life without ever being given a reason to understand it as extraordinary. Hive Tersium. You've already been there. Warhammer 40,000 Darktide was released in November 2022. Set entirely within a single Hive city, Hive Tersium. spelled Tertium, not tertium, tertium. A competitor video covering the same location misspelled it in the transcript. The audience caught it immediately. The audience was correct, and the audience will always catch this because they live here. Peak concurrent players on Steam at launch, 108,395. Tertium is the capital of Atoma Prime, center of the Mobian domain, constructed in the 35th millennium. Population approximately 90 billion. The planet's ruler is Lord Constance Margrave. Atoma Prime manufactures war supplies, and Tertium is its industrial and administrative heart. The name implies it's the third hive on Atoma Prime, Tertium meaning third, which means at least two others exist on the same planet, each presumably at comparable scale. The chaos corruption driving Darktide's narrative spreads through the city as a Nurgle-aligned plague, transforming citizens into poxwalkers and groaners through warp-infused infection that doesn't follow biological rules. The Inquisition's response to 90 billion people being consumed by chaos dispatch convicted criminals as an infiltration team. The lore's framing is that Atoma Prime wasn't considered important enough to warrant serious Imperial military deployment. 90 billion people, below the priority threshold. The Imperium is a large organization with a specific and unsentimental triage process. If you've played Darktide, you've done field work. You've moved through Transit Hub HL16-11, called Chasm Terminus in-game, a transit junction serving a city of 90 billion, with vaulted ceilings that make the space feel cathedral scale, until you notice the exposed pipes, and the residue, and the graffiti scratched into devotional stonework by someone who ran out of prayers and switched to editorializing. You've cleared Metal Fab 36, the industrial factories and smelters that look exactly like what happens when you ask the 41st millennium to build a factory, and the architecture department asks how many Aquillas should go on the load-bearing columns. You've moved through shanty settlements erected inside the sewer infrastructure, gaps between walls that weren't designed to be inhabited, populated by people who ran out of official space and built their own. Tertium is architecturally distinct from Necromunda, Imperial Gothic rather than pure industrial, heavier on devotional weight, scripture carved into structural members because nothing in the Imperium is purely functional. But the underlying experience of moving through it's identical. Manufactured dark, recycled air carrying the metallic taste of everything it passed through on the way down. The constant low presence of machinery that can't stop because the machinery is the difference between 90 billion people alive and 90 billion people very quickly dead. Competitors who have covered Hive Tertium as a lore topic, without naming Darktide, are describing a city that over 100,000 players were simultaneously exploring at launch, without acknowledging that any of them exist. The audience exists. They've run those corridors. Their physical experience of that architecture is as close to primary source research as Hive City documentation gets, and it deserves to be credited as such. The logistics of impossibility. How do you actually sustain 90 billion people inside a sealed vertical structure? Badly, through systems that would be criminal in any functional civilization, and with enough precision that the structure has kept running since the 35th millennium without anyone calling it a success. Food starts at the top. Real food, agricultural produce, animal protein, is available to Spire residents and described as an expensive luxury. Mid-hive, factory-produced food, sometimes algae-based, the kind of nutrition that does the job without making any promises about experience. For the lower levels, corpse starch. Official lore is explicit on what corpse starch is, a synthetic food created from the recycled dead of hive worlds, produced by the corpse grinder guilds and distributed as a gray paste. Supplementary to other food sources rather than the sole nutrition at lower levels, but present, consumed, and the lore does not obscure what it's made from. The gray paste is on the menu. Supplemented in the underhive by fungal farming, edible slime cultivation, and whatever falls off the back of a water guild delivery. The food chain for billions of people at the bottom of a 12-mile vertical column includes, without euphemism, the processing of the dead. Air is managed by the Air Guild, which controls distribution across Necromunda's hive cities. Air enters at the top, passes through billions of people across successive levels, and is pumped progressively downward as it degrades. The precise oxygen generation mechanism, whether chemical, biological, or industrial, isn't fully specified in available official sources, but the Air Guild's existence implies artificial production at scale, which means someone is manufacturing breathable air and billing you for access to it. You didn't consent to this arrangement. You were born into it, and your children will be born into it, and nobody in your family line has ever known what air smells like before it went through this process. Water is distilled from upper hive discharge, processed waste output of the levels above, cleaned to some functional threshold, and distributed downward by the Water Guild at prices calibrated for monopoly conditions. Power costs extra per watt. Every biological necessity is a guild monopoly, which means a guild has a financial interest in every breath you take and every glass of water you drink and every lumen of light that lets you see your work. Scale all of this to tertium, 90 billion people breathing, consuming water, generating waste. The sump at the bottom of a hive that size, the cumulative industrial and biological output of that population, accumulated since the 35th millennium, is a quantity that language handles poorly. The lore's description is that it's navigable by submersible. That's the minimum viable characterization of a toxic sea produced by more than 11 times Earth's current total population across roughly 6,000 years. Not a byproduct, an environment. The Gaunt's Ghosts novels describe the smell of a hive city after artificial rain as wet concrete. Neutral baseline. Below that, the Necromunda sources add chemical burn in the throat, the specific thickness of recycled air that carries traces of everything the hive has processed, the industrial noise that underhive residents experience as ambient rather than intrusive because it has never stopped in their lifetimes or their parents' lifetimes. Official Necromunda source material describes the underhive as an extremely unhealthy place. Heavy industry, squalid living conditions, and accumulated fumes compressing into the air everyone breathes. Violence as atmospheric condition, as weather pattern, as something you can smell when you open your door in the morning. Where the analogies finally give up. The New York comment was right. The mid-hive is the outer boroughs, dense, industrial, expensive, grinding, functional in the way that real cities are functional, which is to say barely and at cost. The spire is the sealed altitude economy. The underhive is what happens when a city stops pretending to manage its lowest districts and starts treating those districts as infrastructure instead. Kowloon Walled City, at 1.25 million people per square kilometer, was the densest human settlement in recorded history. It existed for roughly 40 years before being judged politically intolerable and cleared. The underhive has been accumulating since before the current hive was built. Centuries, millennia, with the ruins at the bottom dating to civilizations nobody can name. Nobody is demolishing the underhive. It's the foundation. Every comparison lands. Every comparison breaks at the number. New York, 8.8 million people. One hive city at the documented low end of the canonical range, 10 billion. More than the entire current population of Earth in one city on one planet. Hive Tersium, 90 billion. Earth, 8 billion total. Tertium contains more than 11 times everyone alive on this planet right now, in a single mid-range city. Necromunda as a whole planet, over 100 billion, across multiple hive cities, on a surface with no clean air anywhere outside the walls, and the entire surface used up just to sustain what's built on top of it. The Imperium spans 32,380 hive worlds, each typically carrying between 5 and 20 hive cities, each hive holding between 10 and 100 billion people. The Imperium-wide total runs to at least 1 quadrillion souls, 1,000,000 times a billion. That's not the population of a single city. That's the organization the hive cities are a component of, feeding their industrial output into something at that scale. And the people doing the feeding are the dock workers and the slime farmers and the sump prospectors and the guild-taxed mid-hive laborers who have never in their lives made a decision about any of this. The people at the bottom of that structure have never seen a sky. They breathe air that has already been breathed by people dozens of miles above them, filtered down through the full vertical extent of the hive until it carries traces of everything the structure has consumed. They eat gray paste made from the dead. They pay a guild for water. They live at the bottom of a 12-mile column of accumulated civilizational output, on top of ruins from before anyone's memory, in the dark. And they keep the hive running through sheer labor continuity. Because the hive stops working if they stop. And if the hive stops working, everyone in it dies simultaneously. And they get up and go to work. There's a member of the Hell's Reach Dockers Union who showed up for a shift at a fuel port. An anonymous dock worker on Hell's Reach, on the ocean of storms, on a planet named after a concept from a theology that predates the 41st millennium by 40,000 years. Someone whose union card is the only formal institutional acknowledgement of their existence above the level of census population figure. Someone who has never breathed unrecycled air, never eaten food that wasn't processed by some guild upstream, never stood outside at night and looked at a sky that extended past the structure above them. Someone who had, before any of this, a specific and rational fury about their conditions, about guild pricing, about the power premiums, about the air that tasted like it had been through 50 million people before reaching them, and simultaneously, no framework for imagining anything different, because the alternative requires a sky, and they have never had one. The orcs came through the dockyard gates. 60% of the civilian population of that hive was in the docks. That is what a hive city is. Not the space marines. Not the named commanders who get the novels and the statues and the commemorative bolter rounds. The hive city is the dockers union member who showed up for a shift and got a siege. The person cultivating edible slime in the dark and calling it agriculture. The billions of people inside structures so old nobody knows what's at the bottom, doing their 9 to 5, breathing whatever came down the pipe this morning, convinced this is normal because it's the only normal they have ever known. There are tens of billions of those people per city. There are 32,380 hive worlds. The New York comment was right. It had absolutely no idea how right it was. Subscribe if you want more stories like this.